Well, the headline title of this panel is the social safety net. The subhead description includes some questions about macroeconomics and full employment, so I just want you to know nobody's going rogue if they start talking about that. I think if Jason, as threatened, starts talking about the wealth tax, someone will have gone rogue at that point, but otherwise, no. So I'm just going to introduce the speakers in the order they'll be talking and then give a couple sentence descriptions for why we chose this order. It's not the most well thought out thing ever, but it had a little bit of thought. We'll start with Jason Furman, currently of Harvard University and former chair of the CEA in the Obama administration, among many other policy positions. Jason's going to talk about maximizing the gains to low and moderate income households through smart macroeconomic stabilization policy, basically ensuring we don't leave opportunities for employment or wage growth on the table by either prematurely reining in expansions or failing to fight downturns with sufficient policy effort. Next, we'll have Jesse Rothstein, currently of University of California, Berkeley, and the director of the Institute for Research on Labor and Employment, also formerly an economist in the Obama administration, both at the CEA and Department of Labor. Jesse's going to talk more about sort of microeconomic strategies to boost incomes, both through the labor market, but also for those who are not working. And finally, we'll have Hilary Hoynes, the Haas Distinguished Chair in Economic Disparities, also at Berkeley. And she will drill down on policies that deliver income to people, especially children, even when they are in families that can't find or are unable to work. I hope and expect that these remarks are going to provide lots of ideas about how to use policy both at the pre-tax and transfer and post-tax and transfer level to make sure growth is widely shared, and will provide really good grist for discussion. So without any further discussion from me, Jason.
I want to talk about the social safety net. And want to start by just giving you a picture of what's happened over the last roughly 50 years in the social safety net. This is using something like the supplemental poverty measure. So this isn't the official poverty measure that you may have seen, which in the United States is a very problematic measure because it includes some taxes and transfers, excludes others. This is a measure that consistently in the black line counts no taxes and transfers and reflects poverty based on market income with things like local adjustment, health cost adjustment, and the like. And you see from 1965 to the present, that form of poverty was basically completely unchanged, reflecting the slow income growth that we know there's been at the bottom of the income distribution. Back in 1965, the post-tax and transfer poverty level was almost exactly the same as the market income poverty level. That's because some people were lifted above the poverty line by transfers, but a lot of people were taxed below the poverty line. If you were a family of 4 in 1965 that earned a little bit above the poverty line, you were paying net taxes, and those net taxes were taxing you into poverty. So in 1965, you had people moving both directions. Since 1965, you've had a steady expansion of the safety net. It's an important aspect of a way in which our fiscal system has become much more progressive and much more redistributive, and grounded in something like the Rawls difference principle that we heard a lot from the philosophers yesterday, one that I think we should place a lot of weight on in thinking about the overall fiscal system. I'll do a brief advertorial. You see the numbers jump up an awful lot when Gene Sperling arrived in the Obama administration in 2009. And just to understand what the nature of this expansion is, there's some changes going on underneath this. You're shifting from things like AFDC, which was the so-called welfare program that was in effect until 1996, to things like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the refundable portion of the Child Tax Credit, which were steadily expanded over much of this period. You have so you have a shift from sort of not requiring work to requiring work. You have other programs like SNAP, Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or food stamps, that basically expanded almost steadily throughout this, sort of unsteadily enough that Hilary could use it as identification for a couple of papers. But since then, partly administratively, partly legislatively, a lot of the expansion actually in the George W. Bush administration, which did more categorical eligibility. So the poverty rate measured with taxes and transfers has come down a lot, come down by about 40%. In terms of just sort of a political observation, the two things that have been successful are things that can be attached to the label children, and the things that you can attach to the label work. Where you can't attach those two labels, you have an awful lot that's fallen through the cracks. Something like the Affordable Care Act was difficult in part because a lot of the expansion there was actually for childless adults, because you'd gotten a lot of the children, you'd gotten a lot of the families, you'd gotten a lot of the old people, all the sympathetic groups, and sort of one of the least sympathetic groups that was left and needed to be dealt with in that legislation. If I was asking what some of the holes were in the system, it would be things like the earned income tax credit for workers without qualifying children, either because they don't have them or because they're non-custodial parents. They get at most $500. They get it if they make between some tiny income range. And I think if you make minimum wage full-time, it's basically gone or almost gone. So I think identifying, politically, you can do more if it's children and work. So if you want to do the politically easy thing, do those. Look at where you don't have children and where you don't have work, and you're more likely to see some of the gaps in those spaces. Because we are allowed to talk about macro, wanted to talk a little bit about that flat market income poverty line. In some sense, all of the discussion we've had about inequality has been discussion about why that black line has been relatively flat over that entire period of time. I just want to talk a tiny bit about one of the parts of it, which is not the structural parts, the minimum wage, labor union, skill bias, technological change, slowdown in education, and all the other things that might be on your list. But just to look at what's gone on in terms of the relationship between, on the left, the unemployment rate and average hourly earnings in nominal terms. This is for production and non-supervisory workers, where you see quite a strong relationship between the two of those. This is data since the year 2000. If you look at the same exact relationship for core PCE, it's nearly flat. It wasn't always this way. If you look before 2000, these two lines look quite similar. If you do since 2000, they look like this, whether you're doing the unemployment rate, you're doing EPOP, you're doing some narrow concept like short-term unemployment, and with a variety of different price and wage measures. There's a lot of macroeconomic debate and discussion around this. Some of this might be the central bank is targeting inflation shocks, so you're going to observe a flat relationship between slack and inflation, and observe they won't offset the shocks on wages. And so to the degree that's correct, this may be a little bit less exploitable by policymakers than it looks like, but I think there's a lot of other reasons to think that we should at least try reasonably hard to try to exploit this big difference. In other words, a hotter economy means faster wage inflation, faster price inflation, but the wage inflation effect is even bigger than the price inflation effect, which is to say real wages go up. And that's certainly consistent with just this remarkable fact that if you look at the last, you compare the last years of the Clinton administration and the last 3 years, in both cases you had similar unemployment rates. In this expansion, average real wages are growing more slowly than they did in that one. In part, I think, because productivity growth, trend productivity growth, is about 1.5 percentage points below what it was in that expansion. You look at wages in the bottom, the reduction in inequality, which is partly due to the hot economy, but also partly due to a lot of states raising their minimum wages, has more than offset the slower overall productivity growth, and meant if you had a choice between the late stage Clinton and the last 3 years, if you were in the bottom 40%, you would have picked the last 3 years over that. And I should say it's not just the last 3 years. This pattern of faster wage growth at the bottom has been true since, I think, about 2014. The last topic I want to talk about is one that links the macroeconomics that I've been talking about with microeconomics and the social safety net at the beginning. And that is that, to date, I think monetary policy has done a spectacular job. I don't know how anyone could complain when the unemployment rate is at 3.5 and inflation is within a rounding error of the Fed's 2% target. But a lot of people are terrified about what happens in the next recession, because you normally cut rates by 6 percentage points. In the next recession, we won't even be able to cut them by 2 percentage points. That leads you to look at fiscal policy. The first thing in fiscal policy is automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers are basically, you can measure in part by the size of your government spending and revenue. Countries that spend more and tax more have larger automatic stabilizers than countries that spend less and tax less. Just taxes go up and down more. Second is the progressivity of your system. For a given level of taxes and spending, the more progressive your system is, the more elastic your revenue and spending will be to the business cycle, and the stronger your automatic stabilizers. If you look at those first two, the United States is quite low for spending and revenue as a share of GDP, and is relatively unprogressive compared to other countries, which is to say we have among the weakest automatic stabilizers. One way to make up for that would be to have larger government spending and revenue as a share of GDP, which I'm all for. Second way would be for a given amount of spending and revenue to be more progressive. I'm all for that. And there's a third way, though, that maybe Greg Mankiw would join me in being for as well, which is to just add more contingency into the current system. The optimal length of unemployment insurance is going to be longer in a recession than it is in a boom. Build automatic triggers in. States need fiscal relief in a recession rather than having Congress pass it in the sort of willy-nilly manner it has, make it automatic. Have tax cuts every time the unemployment rate rises by a certain amount over a certain period of time, and the like. And a lot of those have the feature that if you expand the social safety net, either making it bigger in absolute terms, making it more progressive, or even just making it adjust optimally to the business cycle. So if you're concerned about the trade-off between consumption smoothing in unemployment insurance and moral hazard in unemployment insurance, and some people are more or less concerned about that trade-off. The optimal trade-off does change, and so just make the programs a little bit more microeconomically optimal, a little bit better at serving their consumption smoothing function. And if we did those types of steps on the social safety net, it would actually help our macroeconomic performance. If it helped our macroeconomic performance, it would help with some of the wage, both level and inequality that I showed before, and it would be part of that 50-year-long reduction in poverty as a result of the social safety net that I showed you. Thank you.
In talking about this, I'm not going to be bound by political feasibility. Jason mentioned some potential constraints on what kinds of safety net programs might be feasible, but none of the other sessions have been bound by that, so why should I? And last prefatory remark is I decided to solve the problem of not being able to figure out which way to advance the slides by only having one slide. Yes. So I think we've heard a lot over this about how badly the labor market has been performing, and I think part of the idea of having the safety net session at the end is how much of a difference can we make up for the underperformance of the labor market through the safety net? Jason, among others, has convinced me that the answer is probably not that much. That there are things we can do around the edges, and there are ways that we can make the safety net a lot better, but we're not going to substitute for a labor market that doesn't deliver median wage growth for 40 years. There's no plausible safety net that's going to do that. But there are things we could be doing better with our safety net programs. And so I'm going to kind of use a typology that I first heard from Larry Katz, slightly adjusted. And on the left here, I've kind of put what you might think of as 4 goals of what we want to accomplish with the safety net program. One is that for people who lose their jobs, you may want to allow them to smooth consumption. This is what we have unemployment insurance for. It's a pretty clear need to cushion against the shock that arises in many people's lives. Second, we want to support children. I think we have a lot of evidence. I mean, first on a kind of moral or ethical stance, there's just no justification for dramatic differences in opportunities across kids based on which kinds of parents they get. And there's good reason that we would want to use the safety net to try to deal with that. But also, I think Hilary and Sandy and others have lots of work over the last decade or so, just showing that purely from an investment perspective, investments in children pay off. That you're going to get big benefits in terms of the children's long-run outcomes that are likely to cover the costs just through the future taxes they pay. So we definitely want to invest in children. Third is we want to support low-wage workers. That one of the risks that you might think we face beyond from a Rawlsian perspective is we might wind up at the wrong point in income distribution, and we might want the safety net to protect you against that risk. And this part obviously becomes more important as pre-tax inequality goes up. Then there's just more risk that people are facing that you want to protect against. And last, that we want to allow people who don't work or who can't work to survive. That whether you think that's because you are disabled or somehow unable to work, whether you think you have family circumstances that make it very difficult for you to work, or whether the macroeconomy makes it impossible for you to work because you can't find a job. All of those are reasons to think that we'd like some way of protecting that. If you think about those as kind of the four rough goals, then we've got a bunch of programs. And the programs don't align all that well with those goals. That several of our programs are trying to cover multiple of the goals. Others aren't working that well. So what I've listed here on the right is kind of cash or near cash programs. I could have come up with a parallel list of healthcare programs that have similar issues, but I'll focus on the cash and near cash programs. Start with unemployment insurance. This is a program that's not, I would say, in great shape right now. A number of red states decided that they didn't like President Obama and decided to get back at him by punishing their most vulnerable workers, and they've cut their unemployment insurance programs pretty dramatically. And that's been okay because the unemployment rate is 3.5%, but it's going to be a real problem when a recession comes. In part, this was gamesmanship where they were trying to get the federal government to pick up more of the cost, but in any case, we got now 12, 13, 14 weeks of benefits in many places. It's just not going to work when the labor market gets weak. So I think we need to do some work on that one. Setting unemployment insurance aside, because I do think that's a somewhat different program than the others, our big three other programs are the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, and SNAP. Those are all, to first approximation, conditioned on having kids and on working. There are some ways you can get SNAP if you're not working, but roughly these are conditioned on that, which means that they're kind of mixing up a couple of the different goals. Are these programs that are designed to invest in children, or are they designed to reward work, or what? I think that leads to failure to pursue the goals as well as we could if we were clearer about which ones we were trying to pursue. So I'll talk about that. Traditionally, the program we had for people who are out of work was welfare. But traditionally, welfare doesn't exist anymore. Like, we have a program called welfare, but the caseloads are just so low that we should think that this is not really doing much. So roughly, if you don't have kids, you aren't eligible for it. But even if you do have kids, if you're out of work for the long term, you're probably not getting welfare benefits. So I think that needs a lot of work. The other program we have for people who aren't working is SSI and SSDI, disability insurance programs. Those are conditional on disability evaluation. It's not clear that being able to pass an SSDI disability test is the only circumstance under which we want out-of-work benefits. Because they're meant for people who are permanently disabled, they're very sticky programs. There's lots of evidence that once you get on it, you're just not going to get off because you had to tell the government that you're permanently disabled. And you might think you'd be able to make it a little bit less sticky if you didn't have to certify that you would never be able to work again to get on them. And again, they don't do a very good job of serving people who just can't find work, not because they're disabled, but because the labor market isn't providing jobs. And there's some debate in the literature about whether they're serving as a backup form of unemployment insurance. But whether they are or not, we don't really want them to be doing that. So let me talk a little bit about how one could try to improve these programs to better meet these goals. I guess I should mention there's one on this list that I haven't mentioned, general relief. That's a first approximation doesn't exist either unless you're in Los Angeles. There are some county programs that provide welfare benefits to people without children, but most places don't have them, and they're very, very small. Okay, so what could be better? I think on unemployment insurance, the path forward is relatively clear. As Jason mentioned, we need automatic triggers for unemployment insurance extensions in recessions. It doesn't make sense for us to be having to get something through Congress that usually comes 6 months too late and fight over it and have it subject to all of the substantial costs of getting anything through Congress these days. I think we also need to either abandon or strengthen the federalist model of unemployment insurance. The gamesmanship that's happening right now is not healthy. For supporting children, it's really hard to argue that children should only be supported if their parents work, or that children whose parents don't work shouldn't get the investments they need. So I think if you believe that we should be investing in children, then you want a child allowance that's not conditional on parent employment. I think there's a good case that it should reach higher up in the income distribution than, say, the EITC does. Maybe it shouldn't reach quite as high as the child tax credit does, which now phases out at around $400,000 a year of annual income. You don't need to go quite that high, but it should be higher up. I think we probably would want something comparable in generosity to the current child tax credit, so around $2,000 per child would be a good kind of starting place for something like this. Maybe more generous at younger ages where the costs are higher. And of course, you wouldn't want to stop with cash. You also need things like childcare programs, various in-kind programs. Okay, so that's investments in children. If you want to support workers, I think an EITC-like program is the right way to do it, but that shouldn't be conditioned on having children. That non-workers should be eligible for an EITC also, and not just the tiny EITC that currently exists. There's a trade-off about how far up in the income distribution you want that to reach. If you're worried about the stagnation of median wages, that makes you want to kind of go a little bit higher up in the income distribution than the current EITC does. I would be inclined to go a little bit further up, but I don't think you're going to be able to solve the entire stagnation through most of the distribution through an EITC. It's not going to make up for stagnating median wages. And then the last piece is supporting non-workers. I think the evidence is clear that work requirements end up chasing out more deserving people than they avoid undeserving people. Whether that's a politically viable argument, I don't know, but I think there's a good argument that the work requirements that we have don't really work and aren't really defensible unless we have some kind of a guaranteed job program to go with them. And that was the previous panel, so I won't go into that. You want it to be just barely enough to live on, but not enough to live on well if you were going to try to design an out-of-work program. And then if you had that with an in-work credit program, you'd have to phase out one as the other one phases in. And then that combination ends up meeting each of those goals. You might notice that the combination of the out-of-work and the in-work programs start to look an awful lot like a negative income tax. And I don't think that's such a terrible thing. I think it's really hard to argue that the problem that we've had in the last few decades is a shortage of low-scale labor supply. And so maybe it wouldn't be such a terrible thing if we discouraged some people from working and drove up market wages a bit with that, get the incidence going in the right direction rather than the wrong direction. So I would be okay with it being an NIT. You then face the natural question is, if we're going to do that, should we go all the way from an NIT to a UBI? I think there's a big difference between a system that gives a barely livable transfer to people who aren't working and phases out pretty quickly to around $2,000 to $4,000 for somebody in the second or third quintile, and then another program that gives that livable transfer throughout the entire income distribution. The one that gives it to everybody costs on the order of Social Security plus Medicare plus Medicaid put together. That's not a small investment. By the way, it wouldn't replace those programs because you can't give $12,000 a year to an elderly person and say, buy healthcare with that. So you need those as well. I'm pleased to hear that Greg likes the idea of adding 20% to the marginal tax rate to pay for this. I personally would not have a flat 20% tax. If you wanted to pay for something, I would have a much more progressive tax, and I don't think we're going to get 20%. So if you think that back of the envelope, you might get a 4% tax rate on the top 1%, that gets you about 10% as much revenue in the back of Greg's envelope as his version does. and that would pay for a $1,200 per year UBI. If I had that kind of money to distribute, I wouldn't give it to everybody. I would have it be more progressively distributed. Now, Greg's right that the combination of my NIT plus a tax on the top 1% can be expressed as a UBI with a highly nonlinear tax schedule. But I think the fact that it's a highly nonlinear tax schedule makes it a meaningfully different program. It's a much more progressive program if you do that. Okay, let me, in 1 minute left, just take on the kind of other argument, discuss a little bit the kind of labor market arguments for a UBI. There are some arguments that you hear out there that robots are about to take all the jobs, and so we've got to figure out a way to allow people to live without work. I'm kind of skeptical that robots are going to be fundamentally different than technical change we've already had, or that there will just not be any jobs anymore. I think the issue is about job quality, not job quantity that we face. But if you are really worried that the robots are going to reduce the demand for labor, then the problem we have is we need to reduce labor supply. And that's what a UBI is trying to do. If it's making it possible for people to live without work, it's making it possible for them not to search for work. Again, it's a little hard to argue that we both want to have work requirements and programs to try to discourage labor supply. I think we've got to figure out whether we have too much or too little labor supply and then pursue policies that address that. If you do think we have too much labor supply, the income effect that you get from a UBI is probably not the right way to reduce it. Substitution effects are stronger, and that leads you again to something more like an NIT. So I will stop there. Thank you.
So as was pointed out earlier, what I'm going to do is to try to drill down a little bit onto focusing on the social safety net that's targeted at families with children or children, however you want to think about it. And the reason why I want to do that is, number one, just the starting point is they're the demographic group, at least age-wise, in the United States that has the highest poverty rates. So it's important just to think about from that context. And number two, as raised earlier, children are uniquely suited to be thinking about in terms of issues around intergenerational mobility and what it means to have low incomes at this age and the potential returns from doing more spending and investment on this group. So that's why I'm going to sort of organize my thoughts on that population. And I want to sort of accomplish three things. The first one is, and maybe even the second one, are a bit easier given the conversation we've already had today before this panel and in this panel. But the first thing I want to do is sort of talk a little bit more about a bit of looking backward and a bit of flushing out what we're doing right now in our social safety net in the United States. And in so doing, try to point out where I think the holes are. Number two, be a little concrete about possible paths forward in a more quantitative way. So I was on a National Academy of Sciences panel that reported out our report about 6 months ago, and the task of our panel was to identify policies and simulate them that have an evidence base that would reduce child poverty and deep poverty by 50% within 10 years. So, they're going to be social safety net programs, not like pre-K, because we were dictated by a statement of work that results needed to occur within 10 years. So I'm going to show you a few things from that, like what would it take to get us a 50% reduction in child poverty, and what would it cost? And then number three, step back a little bit to remind everybody that spending to reduce poverty for children isn't just a current period snapshot. And it yields a lot of returns in the long run that we didn't really have a lot of quantitative purchase on until relatively recently. So it seems worth talking about that. So the current state of the social safety net for children. So what this does is just a static calculation, no behavioral change, starting from the baseline of all programs intact for children for I think it's 2015 is the data, adjusted for underreporting, so that number might look a little lower than you would expect, 13% based on the supplemental poverty level, but it does adjust for underreporting in the survey data. And then one by one, we just zero out each element of the social safety net and just ask the question, how many more children would be poor if we did that? And so what jumps out of this analysis is, number one, the most work towards reducing poverty in our social safety net comes from the tax credits, more the EITC than the refundable child tax credit, but we'll just call them the tax credits, and then also SNAP. And if I were to show you this graph looking at deep poverty, the incidence of having after-tax and transfer income below 50% of the poverty line, SNAP would jump out. And actually the second largest anti-poverty program for deep poverty in America for children is actually Social Security, little known fact. So this gives you an idea about which programs are currently doing the most work to reduce child poverty. And you'll see that also on this list are SSI, Social Security. You don't see TANF on this list. It's there, it's in other benefits, but it's very small. I think it's 0.2 or something like that. So even deep poverty, our current quote unquote cash welfare system is doing very little for reducing child poverty or poverty in general. So that's sort of point number one. We already sort of talked about the earned income tax credit. The earned income tax credit and the child tax credit are work condition programs. Many of the programs on this list, as Jesse sort of mentioned earlier, have a lot more work contingencies in them than are obvious from the outside. And so I'll come back to that in just a little bit. So in sort of summing up and taking this baseline period and looking backwards, it's important to point out that over the time period of this graph, which goes back to 1990, and if we take that social safety net and put it in buckets in a couple different ways, two things really jump out. If you look at the graph on the right, you'll see that in 1990, on the first year on this graph, 70% of the social safety net targeted at children went to families that didn't have earnings. And what you see at the end of this period is that that has basically reversed between the share of income of cost of these programs that are going to families with children and the lack of assistance that are going to those with no earnings. Another way, though very related way, to look at it is to say, where in the income distribution are these dollars going? And so the graph on the left does that exercise, though it cuts it off at 200% of poverty. So as Jesse said, the child tax credit extends very high up the income distribution. I'm not counting all those dollars there. I'm at least starting from the operating organization that this is under 200% of poverty, just to understand that dynamic. And what you can see there is that essentially all of the growth in our social safety net over this 25-year period is going to the more advantaged part of the disadvantaged population. So the expansions of Medicaid for children, the child tax credit, and some of the EITC expansions are actually, costing real dollars, but are going further up the income distribution than at the very bottom. So this, for me, along with a lot of work about, for example, I did some work that looked at the Great Recession as an opportunity to, quote unquote, stress test the social safety net. And one of the things that jumps out of that is that we did very well at sort of income protection around poverty and levels and above that. So for example, in Jason's graph that he showed us at the very beginning, where we had this huge increase in market income poverty in the Great Recession, though we didn't pay a lot of attention to it, it was quite flat on the supplemental poverty poverty measure through the Great Recession. Like, that's an incredible success that our social safety net provided that protection. But if you kind of dig a little deeper and look further down the distribution, there was more vulnerability and more of a sort of response of deep poverty and below than we would have predicted from previous cycles. So there's clearly less protection at the bottom. Almost no matter what way you go at it, whether just in simple descriptive graphs of where the dollars are here, or looking at sort of behavioral responses to shocks across the distribution, you very quickly conclude that we're spending more, but it's moved up the distribution. Part of that is targeting at work, and part of that is a bit more than that. So then next, just to illustrate, it's just an illustration, what could we do to reduce child poverty by half, starting with the system we have right now? These calculations that I'll just very quickly describe do have dynamic adjustments in them. So we read the literature and made adjustments for labor supply that we thought were the best evidence suggested in order to simulate a change in policy and encompass impacts that would work directly through the payment or indirectly through changes in employment and earnings. And so we did one simulation in our National Academy of Sciences report that was focused on a work-only set of policies. Minimum wage, EITC, and some other things, and we couldn't get there. You just can't make the programs big enough in order to reduce child poverty by half with work contingent programs only. So what these two simulations show you are two different ways to try to get to a 50% reduction. And the first column uses pre-existing policies. So essentially expands out-of-work assistance through SNAP and through housing vouchers. And the one on the right brings in a child allowance. And so think of a child allowance as being an extension of the current child tax credit, which gives $2,000 per child up until about $400,000 a year, as Jesse pointed out, but does not go to the very bottom of the distribution. So think of the child tax credit or a child allowance as basically extending that child tax credit, expanding it a little bit, but going all the way down to zero earnings. And that Canada implemented a child allowance a couple of years ago, the Canadian Child Benefit, that's on track to reduce child poverty in Canada by half. It's about 6,000 Canadian dollars per year, is paid through the Social Security system on a monthly basis. So it's sort of complementary to the lump sum benefits that many people really appreciate and like about the Earned Income Tax Credit. So that's the simulation on the right. And then what both simulations share is an expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit. Also, something we haven't talked a lot about in these 2 days is actually using the child and dependent care tax credit, which now is very tilted towards people like us in the room in our income category, and basically making that a refundable tax credit, but again, focused on, is in a way to get more child tax benefits. That also has very large earnings as well as direct impacts. And so you do that all together, you get 50% reductions in regular poverty and deep poverty at a cost of about $90 or $100 billion per year. And it also delivers, as it turns out, net employment. Because the gains from the EITC and the expansion of the child and dependent tax care credit outweighs the negative employment effects embodied in ordinary out-of-work programs like SNAP and housing vouchers, or also the more moderate version of that in a child allowance. So those are two different ways that you can get there. So just to end, all of this discussion about children, the social safety net, is focused on the lens of we need to reduce poverty today. That's motivated by this broader discussion, this fantastic discussion that we're having around inequality in these last 2 days. But it's also really important to point out that when you're talking about children, it also begs one to ask, what difference does it make to be doing more, quote, redistribution aimed at children? What difference does it make to their life trajectory? And, maybe 15 years ago, we didn't know the answer to this question. And I would say today, we definitively have a lot of evidence that points to the importance in the long run trajectory of these programs that we have. So we've got a lot of evidence from Medicaid, an enormous amount of evidence from Medicaid that shows more access to public health insurance when children are young, not only does things in that period, but increases their human capital, increases their education and college going and earnings and health in adulthood. We've got evidence from SNAP that providing more access to resources or food that those resources purchase, particularly in early life, leads to improvement in adult health. And now we have some evidence from work that I've been doing that it also has impacts on human capital, lower incarceration rates for African American men, lower mortality rates in adulthood. Also evidence about the long-run effects of the Earned Income Tax Credit and cash welfare. And the fabulous recent paper by Hendren and Sprung-Kieser sort of takes this evidence that I just spoke of, along with about 100 other things, and uses one unifying model to try to demonstrate the sort of long-run benefits to these investments. But I want to just end with one cautionary note that I think in the real world, a real challenge with this is that when we implement these programs, the costs are super salient and they appear today. And the benefits take quasi-experimental research and a lot of time to wait for them. And I think that challenge makes the conversation around talking about the investment aspects of these programs more difficult in practice. Thank you.
Okay, I want to thank the presenters for being first really interesting, but also being really disciplined and sticking to the time limit. So I think we have a lot of time for both a discussion up here as well as some Q&A from the audience. I think my first question, Jason's first graph, every time I see that, I find that one of the most striking graphs to inform policy. And I want to basically ask a couple questions about it and want everyone to weigh in. I guess my first question is just how is it possible that in an economy that has grown, like productivity growth of about 80% over the span that we see on that graph, we can't get more people over what is essentially a fixed threshold in terms of having market income do some work in reducing poverty? I know that's what this conference is about, but just a little more talk about that. And then in regards to Hilary's last point about how the sort of expansion of the social safety net we've done over the past 40 years has strong long-run investment benefits for kids. I mean, I guess my question is, would that market income performance have even been much worse had we not introduced Medicaid and expanded SNAP over the past couple of decades, which is kind of a scary thought to think about. And so those are my first two thoughts, and maybe since it was his graph, I'll let Jason lead off, but then I absolutely want to hear what Hilary and Jesse think as well.
So the supplementary poverty measure produced by the census is actually a partially relative measure in that as incomes grow, the threshold rises. I showed you an anchored measure, which in theory should be the same. So in theory, it should be absolute, as you said, Josh. I think the fact that we probably have some bias in our measure of inflation means you might want to interpret that as sort of somewhere between absolute poverty being the same over this period and relative poverty, partially relative poverty being the same in this period. I think that is a huge problem in our economy. There's a lot of different causes of it. I think a lot of it just comes straight out of, a slowdown in the increase in educational attainment that Claudia Gold and Larry Katz and so many others have documented. I think the institutions matter. If you look at something like the 90-10 wage ratio for women, that looks an awful lot like the minimum wage looks over that period. So I think different parts of it reflect different parts of distribution. This part, I don't, if it's 50 years from now and we're holding another conference, and market poverty is the same, but we've made further progress on tax and transfers, I'd find that like pretty depressing and almost pretty implausible that we'd be able to do that. But the thing is, at this part of the distribution, you actually can do a lot with taxes and transfers. If you look at the sum total of Obama tax and transfer policies, including the Affordable Care Act, they were a 21% increase in the after-tax income of the bottom quintile. And it wasn't that expensive to do a 21% increase in the after-tax income of the bottom quintile because their income was quite low. You look at the sum total of our policies for the middle quintile, it was a 2% increase in their after-tax income. And to do things for the third quintile, relative to their income at least, costs about, I think, 3 or 4 times as much because their average incomes are 3 or 4 times as high. So I think there's a lot we can do with the social safety net to change the pre-tax distribution at the bottom in quite a meaningful way. I think it's a tool that works much less well or gets much more costly as you move up the income spectrum.
So I guess I'll add a few things. The first is that if we look at the graph of Jason's here, I originally had something in my slide deck, but then pulled it out that shows a similar calculation just for children, just to kind of make the point about how much our social safety net is doing. And it looks very much like this, although a bit bigger. And I think that would be important to point out how much less we're doing for the rest of the population because of the things we've talked about the fact that so much of our expansions have been targeted at families with children. And so I think that just to echo some things that were mentioned earlier, there's a lot more we could do to realize the system that we have now that would create even bigger effects here, because a lot of that is kind of missing an important level of heterogeneity. The other thing is that, you say, Josh, like, would that black line look worse if we hadn't done what we did, in the 60s and 70s and early 80s? And I think the answer is yes. And you might say, well, that's crazy. But if you think of the graph we saw earlier today, I guess in David Elwood's talk, that showed how the percentiles of the earnings distribution have evolved, the 20th percentile is way down. And so that fact alone should actually be pushing market income poverty up. So, I think that there is more going on than meets the eye in the positive side. That is, in fact, there are some really important successes that we have that have sort of, maybe we weren't even aware at the time of what that potential was. And I can't just draw on that graph to know how, what would the black dash line look without those earlier investments. But I think to a kind of rough approximation and a back of the envelope calculation, you could convince yourself pretty quickly that you would expect that to be going upwards more than it has. So.
But something I should have said before, I've said directly because that's just a mechanical calculation. You take someone's income, you add or subtract their taxes and transfers, doesn't give you the incentives. Your first thought might be, we've expanded the social safety net a lot. Income didn't go up. Why don't we expect that the expansion of the social safety net caused it? The answer is, if you do the decomposition, the social safety net has gone up, especially for women with children. That's a group that's seen a big increase in its labor force participation rate. The group that's withdrawn from the workforce is principally men aged 25 to 54. And for them, the social safety net in cash terms is lower today than it was in 1965. And cash plus in kind fell through 2008, although it's risen since then with Medicaid. So I think, to a first approximation, the direct and the indirect are about the same. And then with lags, I don't know what the magnitude of what Hilary's talking about is, but sort of know the sign.
So my role here today is just to say what other people have already said differently. So I'll do it again. We've had worsening earnings or wages for non-college workers pretty consistently over the entire period covered here. What we've done, what's made up for that and kept market income poverty from going up is that we've sent more people to school, and so the educational attainment of the workforce has gone up. Maybe not as fast as we'd like it to, but especially if you don't look at specific cohorts, but you allow the cohort replacement in the workforce, we've had pretty substantial increases in educational attainment, and so those two have roughly offset each other. I think that raises questions about how much educational sending more people to school can solve the problem going forward. Because I think, again, relatively fast growth has barely tread water. But I think that makes it not that surprising, and I think it's consistent with the idea that these past investments have paid off, and we've sent more people to school. But that you can only do that so fast to make up for declining wages.
So staying on the theme of sort of past or present investments in kids having potentially large investment payoffs going forward, and you mentioned the point that the costs are very salient and in the now, the benefits are harder to see in the long run. I mean, we are at this period of time with interest rates are incredibly low, and the prospect of doing more deficit financing of all sorts of stuff seems a bit less scary than it did. I mean, one, how big is the fiscal offset that you get from the investment in kids? Is it enough to say, if we can be patient and wait for 10 years, this will be 70%, 100% fiscally offsetting? And does that mean, yeah, it's not that risky a strategy right now to put it on debt? I mean, I know no one has the exact answer for this, but what do we think about that?
I won't answer the debt question, but I'll take the investment piece. I mean, I think if you think about targeting, like it's not uniformly the case, it's across all of these different interventions, but it seems more often than not that the investments yield more when targeted at younger ages, maybe particularly in the years before school. So if you do the math, you don't really reap the returns until people are in the labor market. So that's 20 years for the beginning of the labor market. So I think it would be interesting. I haven't done it. I could kind of piece it together in my head, but I think you need to be pretty patient for these things to show up, honestly, on the same order of magnitude, though, as pre-K. And I just think what's interesting about that is that maybe it's because of Heckman, maybe it's before that, but people have just sort of internalized the fact that an investment in early childhood education pays off. And so there's no longer we got to pay it up front and we need to be patient for the returns because we've just accepted that paradigm. Although it's still not happening across all states and everything else, but I just think that this is a new way of thinking. And as someone who's spent their whole career thinking about these programs, I didn't really think about it until about 10 years ago. So I don't know what that means. But I do think it does require some patience, but it doesn't seem to me to be out of line with the patience that we just accept for other things.
On the debt question more broadly, Larry Summers and I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs earlier this year about how terrible a wealth tax. About the budget deficit, and our argument, similar to Olivier's presidential address, is there is less reason to be concerned now, given where interest rates are. In fact, there'd be some reason to be concerned about excessive deficit reduction if it lowered interest rates and reduced the scope for conventional monetary policy. We did say, though, that we thought there should be some fiscal anchor, some way to sort of decide what you could do and couldn't do. And to us, the idea that you would pay for things was reasonable. Pay for them taking into account, I've actually, for over a decade, been on the record in favor of dynamic scoring and in favor of dynamic scoring for everything and in favor of dynamic scoring only if it's done by Wendy Edelberg, who's from CBO, not by whoever happens to like a given idea. So, this standard for me would say I think there is a lot of room for investment with low interest rates, with a deficit and debt that's not a problem. But I want to be quite rigorous in understanding, how it paid for itself, with others judging that. And the last thing I'd say, which I don't know the answer to, is what we really care about is things that have really long-run effects. What we're better at modeling, and the only thing we look at when we do fiscal policy in the United States, is the effects over the next 10 years. So is there some way to think about and model and have budget rules that let you sort of accrue gains that take place over a long period of time? This might help certain pro-growth tax policies, and it might help certain, pro-children safety net policies. I think thinking, is there some way to take a longer look in our budget window to accommodate what the benefits of these have would be worth doing?
I think all of you mentioned, maybe not, UI, unemployment insurance, and how not ready for the next recession our current unemployment insurance system is, and just want a couple thoughts from each of you on what you would do to strengthen UI, both to make it a better automatic stabilizer, but then is there anything we can do to help it even, in relatively good times? Yeah, I'll just stop there. So if you could talk about UI, I think it's really important.
Sure. So the easy version is rather than having optional extensions of unemployment benefits whenever a recession hits, we ought to build triggers in. There's just no reason. We know that we're going to do this every time, but we're going to do it several months late, and it will tie up Congress for 2 months, and it's just not a good use of anybody's time to do it that way. And so we ought to make that automatic. It ought to be fully federally funded, which the main extensions have been, but the existing automatically triggered program is not. The harder problem is how do we solve the kind of gamesmanship between the states and the federal government? We can't be having states cut their benefits down to fractions of what they ought to be, and just because the feds will pick up the slack, and that's harder. But I think we have to just mandate that to get the money, you have to have 26 weeks.
Let me, I'm going to answer the question, but I'm going to start by broadening it a little bit. And that is in sort of stepping back on this issue about our social safety net as an automatic stabilizer, sort of broaden that a little bit. One thing becomes really clear that I think unintended consequence of the kind of shift of the social safety net from out of work to in work is that, we just don't have the cushion. And I was partly kind of referring to that when I was talking about the deep poverty argument. But, if you think about the EITC, it's kind of an interesting case. If you look at it on net, it's very neutral, approximately, to the business cycle. But if you sort of break it apart at the spending on two-parent families and the spending on one-parent families, the two-parent family is actually a nice automatic stabilizer, because people lose one earner and they drop into the EITC eligibility, and it provides a cushion. But single earners, they drop out, and there's no stabilizing. SNAP was incredibly effective as an automatic stabilizer in the Great Recession. It's an entitlement, it's there, you get it. States really facilitated it in many contexts. And really notably, cash welfare, which maybe people would think, it was never very cyclical anyways. It's more of structural out of work assistance back in the 80s and 90s. Well, actually not so. I mean, if you look at the 80s recession, you saw AFDC spending go up. And if you look at TANF in the Great Recession, even at its smaller form, it's just like a scatter plot of random dots. If you look at how big was the state's unemployment shock and how much did TANF adjust, there's just no relationship. So there's nothing happening there in that regard. So just sort of worth kind of broadening that. But the one thing I've been thinking about, just to add to Jesse's comments about UI, is a bit less about the weeks and more about the eligibility criteria and how states are changing that as well. Because one thing I don't know the answer to, I don't know if either of you do, is as we've moved towards this work contingent social safety net, where the reality is that we know a lot of people have this kind of very erratic, unstable work, I'm guessing UI is just not helping that group. And so to me, I wonder about how we should rethink UI in the world where we're tying these means-tested benefits to work in order to try to recognize the sort of precarity, if that's the right word, of the current labor market experience, and whether UI, in the nature of the eligibility criteria, just isn't quite meeting need.
So when you work in government, a lot of the proposals you work on reflect tremendous amounts of compromise, things like the Affordable Care Act that I said before. If you want to not compromise, what you want to do is wait for the last year of your administration, work on something that has no chance of passing in an area no one cares about, and assign it to Sandy Black and Jacob Liebenluft, and that would be the Obama unemployment insurance reform proposal, which I think was a masterpiece and a gem, which was hung up on a wall of the White House website, and is probably still there on the archived website for anyone to admire. We addressed a number of things in that proposal, in addition to the automatic triggers I mentioned. One is the coverage of UI has fallen tremendously. We look at these incredibly low UI claims claims right now. We shouldn't be excited about how well the economy is doing. We should be worried about how few people are eligible. It addressed some of the length issues that Jesse said, some of the ways that employment relationships have changed over time and wanting to address those. A few of the different shortcomings in UI. If you take a new job and it pays less, rather than staying in no job that pays nothing, so-called wage insurance, integrated that into the system. I can't remember if we did the following in the system, but we should have, and it was certainly in the other proposal that CAP, Georgetown, and somebody else did, which is when your UI gets exhausted, rather than going from a full flat amount to nothing, maybe do something smaller in between so you don't end up on, as Jesse's documented, disability insurance, which is an absorbing state you stay in for the rest of your life. And then finally integrating more job search and employment assistance, and some of that can even be on the enforcement side, that some period you reevaluate them in a tough way. If they're not looking for a job, which they're supposed to be doing, they stop getting their UI, and in the process encourage them harder and help to match them with jobs. So I think there's a really huge opportunity within UI to do a bunch of very good reforms that would help the labor market, and you just need to take the thing down off our website and do it.
Two quick questions. One question for Hilary. Are there any estimates of the rates of take-up for the various policies aimed in particular at child poverty? And the second one is for Jesse. There is no general equivalence between NIT and universal basic income, because universal basic income could be funded by from other sources than the personal income tax, carbon tax, VAT, whatever. But if you take one that's funded by a personal income tax, and you assume that it's individual and NIT also individual rather than household-based, then surely you can, if you have the same minimum guarantee and you say you have the same break-even point, the two schemes are equivalent in economically speaking, same income effect, same substitution effect. And so if there is any difference, coming back to Greg's presentation, it's just because of the illusion that an NIT scheme is cheaper, because it simply looks cheaper, but in terms of net taxes or net benefit for every taxpayer, whatever the level, it is the same. So there may be a political advantage of defending NIT to the extent that this illusion is widespread in society. People may be willing to buy to accept what looks cheaper. And that's exactly the reason why Thomas Piketty, in the course of the last presidential election, tried to present Benoît Hamon's proposal of universal basic income as a negative income tax, but of course without calling it a negative income tax, because in France, calling it a negative income tax would be sufficient to demolish the proposal forever, both because it's negative, because it's taxation, it sounds like taxation, and because it's associated with Milton Friedman, so proposed by a socialist candidate that wouldn't be on. But so that may be a political advantage, but it sounded as if you were saying that there was also an economic advantage of going for a negative income tax rather than a universal basic income, assuming universal basic income is funded also by a personal income tax.
I think Hilary and I just agree that, well, I'll go first on this. So I think one of the points, I didn't mean to say that they can't be made equivalent to each other. But one of the points that Hilary and I made in our paper about UBI is that the revenue side of however you're going to pay for a UBI, a lot of the questions about that are first order. You can't just say, let's implement a UBI and we'll figure out later how to pay for it. The first order economic effects of a UBI will come from the revenue side. To take the kind of NIT proposal I was talking about and make it into an equivalent UBI implies a very, very nonlinear, very progressive tax schedule. So what I was talking about is a tax rate on the 1% plus a phase out of the UBI, then you wind up with a curve that kind of is flat, jumps up a lot, is flat, and then jumps up a lot again. Again, I'm fine with that. That's a perfectly legitimate tax schedule, but it's a very different thing than Greg's UBI plus a flat tax. And again, how you're going to pay for it is first order. Now, maybe we have a carbon tax source of revenue. Again, we could then argue about whether the right way to spend the money from that is from a demo grant, is with a UBI. But again, the only point is what kind of tax schedule you need to turn an NIT into a UBI is going to be quite different, I think, than the kind of flat tax that Greg outlined.
We actually know a fair amount about take-up of these programs, and they're actually quite high. So for the two biggest ones for kids, the EITC is in the 80s, low 80s, and SNAP, which used to be quite a bit lower, is now up nationally at about 80%. So the take-up rate's pretty high. And there's been a lot of interest. States are very interested in how to figure out ways to help identify and outreach, and states, some states are really increasing barriers to these programs. So they're, kind of using, hidden policy in order to try to make their programs used less. But then there's other states that are, trying to use policies to try to expand access to programs, particularly those that aren't paid for by the state. Like SNAP's kind of interesting because it's a federal program. It's, it's a federal program that states implement. So they bear the administrative cost, but not the main part of the cost. And so there's very interesting dynamics that play out. But overall, I think the take-up rates are pretty high.
This is for Hilary and Jason. I'm just curious, Jesse suggested the negative income tax kind of instead of TANF. I assume it was instead of TANF. So what do you guys think in terms of replacing kind of the cash TANF program in 2 minutes, 2 minutes or less?
Yeah. I guess I'm for it. I think my first order thinking is we need more out of work assistance. Like that feels very strong to me, though I also really like, I sort of share David's view that, we can't do it all out of work, that we need to leverage work and make work pay. And so I would want to still have the subsidy before the NIT phase out. And I think that's what you were implying, but that makes a kind of different version of an NIT than the usual one where we just got one out of work instrument that's being phased out. So I would think it would be very important to have those things both there. So you could basically think of the child allowance as it's an NIT. It's just there's a long range before it's phased out. And, in the NIT in its usual form, we usually think about as first dollar phase out, which I think is a terrible idea. I think we've learned a lot about that. And I think it's important, particularly within the context of what the problem is that we've been talking about for the last day and a half, that it not be so targeted. I'm not putting words in Jesse's mouth, but just to say that.
Just say Aaron Dubé has a proposal for a schedule a lot like that takes the EITC but has a non-zero intercept for it.
And he does it as like taking half of the EITC and turn it to out of work.
I'd put more money in.
You'd put more money. Maybe you'd put more money in, but.
I think a child allowance is a no-brainer and sort of fits within our fiscal constraints. I think when you start to talk about a negative income tax, it's hard to have that conversation absent a conversation about where you can raise revenue, and then if you can only raise this much, what's your next priority and all of that. So I guess I don't know the answer.
You all mentioned the earned income tax credit in terms of its impact on poverty. Hilary, you actually in your list of things talked about that if you did things like child allowance, that the positive work impacts of the EITC, perhaps higher minimum wage, would also overcome that. So much of the work you've done has all pointed on the work incentive, and yet there's now a paper circulating that kind of by Clevin suggesting something different. So I wanted to give the three of you a chance to respond as to whether how seriously one should take that, how much that should be seen as not, or is over impacting the existing more vast literature that EITC does have a positive work incentive.
Yeah, so I think it is true, just kind of looking backwards, and I'm looking at David Elwood to, get a nod from him on this, is that, we do have, I have this paper that shows that like half of the anti-poverty effectiveness of the EITC, at least for children, operates through this employment channel and not just the direct payout of having a tax refund. And so I guess it seems to me that has been a big part of what's created bipartisan support for the earned income tax credit over the decades. And I think the research has been very very consistent, using a lot of different approaches, analyzing different tax reforms, that shows that an expanded EITC leads to increases in employment. And, relatively consistent set of findings, at least for lower educated single mothers, which are the majority of the EITC recipients. So, I think that one paper, we need to put it in the context of the broader literature. And I think the period that I know well, because I've worked with the data and analyzed it extensively, is the Clinton era, 1993 expansion. Sperling era. So sorry. Expansion really does hold up. And I think, there were a lot of things that happened at one time, and a lot of papers have really tried to interrogate that. And it's not an experiment. So there's regressions you can run that absorb more or less information in the data, but I'm fairly convinced that the 93 expansion led to an increase in employment.
Yeah, I do CNBC on Jobs Day a lot, and they tell me the jobs number, and a minute later, I have to tell them what it means, and they have about 10 people that do this, and I'm far and away the most insightful of all 10 of those people, and I want to give you my tip, and you two can be just as insightful as me, which is your view about the economy after you see the jobs number should basically be the same as your view of the economy before you saw the jobs number, and everyone else, the other 9 people, radically changed their view based on whether the number was 40,000 above or below the consensus. I think in general, you want to update a lot less than you think. I would apply that rule to when you see a working paper on Twitter. It works just as well. And on the earned income tax credit, there's except if it's by David Otter. There's a large literature on the earned income tax credit. Some of it's used experimental methods like Paycheck Plus. Some of it's used different data sets. Some of it's used IRS data. Some of it's looked at different ones. That literature left us with a view about the pro-employment effects of the EITC. The Clevin paper, in many respects, seems quite good. In many respects, has a hard time with any type of really clean identification because the way 90 and 1993 were phased in, the one-child and two-child EITCs were both moving at the same time in strange ways. Welfare reform waivers were happening. The way the economy was affecting families with 1, 2, and 3 children might have differed just for economic reasons. And so that paper, as good a paper as is in some respects, is not one that is such a clean, random experiment, super well identified, that I would break the rule I said before, which is don't update too much based on any one data point.
I'm glad I let Jason answer first because he said it better than I would. I believed before that paper came out that the EITC expansion in the mid-90s had expanded female labor supply, and I still believe that. I haven't updated very much. But I just want to say one thing. You can't, if you don't share my view of that, and you do believe that there was no labor supply effect, you can't also believe that I've shown that the EITC is captured by employers. that effect was predicated on there being a labor supply effect. And so there's been some confusion that both the EITC is captured by employers and it doesn't induce more people to work, and those can't both be true.
So I think we're right on end of panel time. So I know people have other questions, but we're going to land this now. Join me in thanking the panel members.